One of the most promising Parisian prodigies ended up going into film scoring. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Georges Auric. Georges Auric was born in Lodève, in the south of France, in February 1899, the son of a local hotel owner. In 1902, the family moved to Montpellier, a major city in the region, having bought a new hotel to run. Lodève was more provincial, whereas Montpellier was the local hub of arts, transportation, and wine. And in 1907, the economic situation piled up in just the right way, such that it sent a lot of the smaller wineries out of business. June of that year boiled over into riots and deaths, and vaulted Émile Auric, Georges' father, to a municipal councillor position in Montpellier to the tune of 97% of the vote. He was part of a coalition between the Radical Party and the Socialists, and as big of a game as they talked, the problem with the economy and the problem with these small wineries and vineyards was not something that the local government could even hope to fix. He would lose his position the very next year, but this sudden revolt, we're talking about 500,000 people in the streets of Montpellier on June 9th alone, was a formative experience for young Georges. It showed him that people working together could get things done, and if there's anything we know about the French, it's that they love a good revolution every now and then. As the viticultural revolt, as it's known, died down, young Georges began his musical career, eventually on the violin, but he hated it, so he switched to the piano. By 8, he was one of the most promising students at the Montpellier Conservatoire. Louis Combe, his teacher, exposed Auric to all of the modern things in music, Debussy and Ravel, and he recalled trying to sight read these at the keyboard. Combe was also influential in exposing his star student to avant-garde literature, not just music. 2 years into his conservatory training, he began composing. The story goes that he went out into the garden and he heard a nightingale sing, and this inspired him to start writing. And Combe was really supportive of this. He had connections at a music journal in Lyon, and through these connections, he got some of Auric's songs read through. The singer, Paula de Lestang, was so taken with this kid's songs that she encouraged his parents to send him to Paris. As an only child and still young at the age of 14, Georges' parents moved with him to the French capital. What we don't get a lot of is just what his early compositions were like. They must have been good because everyone who came into contact with them knew that they needed to follow his career with great interest. But when he was 20, he destroyed a lot of these manuscripts, over 300 pieces of his juvenilia. These were mostly songs and piano pieces that he thought that he could dispense of once he'd reached maturity. A maturity, it must be noted, that typically for Auric didn't come from the world of music directly. Instead, it came from the aesthetics put forth by his friend, the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, which proposed the need for an emergent French nationalism that embraced all schools of thought and expression. There are a few surviving works, but not enough to make sweeping judgments about what his musical style was or the origins from whence it later evolved. What's important for us is that it was good enough to convince his parents to not just let him move to the city, but follow him there. Auric went to classes at the Petit Conservatoire, where there he met future Les Six members Germain Taillefer, Darius Milhaud, and Arthur Honegger. Milhaud recalled how cultured and intelligent Auric was, and how easily composition came to him. Auric ended up enrolling in the Schola Cantorum in 1914, a much more conservative conservatory founded by the almost reactionary Vincent d'Indy. Erik Satie had attended from 1905 to 1910, and Auric, who knew of Satie's sarabands, thought enough of them to write an article praising one of them, and Satie was eager to meet whoever was praising him, and when they met in 1913, Satie was shocked, in the best possible way, to find this kid. Auric made a point later in life of pointing out how Satie always valued young people, as he felt like they were the only folks capable of understanding him. Satie then made a habit of lunching with the Aurics on a weekly basis. Although the Schola Cantorum wasn't exactly Auric's speed, it hadn't been Satie's either. They both went there for the same reason, a solid, fundamental musical grounding. Albert Roussel, one of the professors, was more moderate than the culture of his school, and befriended Auric. The early days of Auric in Paris seemed to just be a litany of the big movers and shakers of the music world, meeting Auric and wanting to help him in his career. Among these was Maurice Ravel, who met him after turning pages on a recital where Auric's music was being performed. Henri Pierre Rocher was another, a writer 2 decades Auric's elder, who began correspondence with the young hotshot. Roussel compared Auric to Rimbaud, with the underlying comparison being that Rimbaud's literary work was all complete before the age of 20. Auric didn't seem poised to burn out because he had other outlets. He was known for being an intense conversationalist with knowledge across a wide variety of fields. And as a result, his vocal music is really quite interesting in that it's tied into the close readings of the texts that he chose to set. But on the other hand, it avoids the stereotypes of text painting. So to give you an example, if a poem says something about going up, then a composer who's engaging in text painting would set some kind of ascending scale or arpeggio, or otherwise, maybe the voice will jump up instead of going down. Auric would, as often as not, cut against the grain of the text. If the text says something about going up, he might stay flat, or he might go down. He would never just go with the text. So, therefore, his music is more of a commentary on the texts that he's setting than just an amplification of what the texts say. In 1916, Auric was deeply frustrated with himself for having hit a kind of compositional roadblock, and though he kept himself active creatively in other fields, he had been not the most prolific composer since the outbreak of hostilities in July 1914. He left the Scala Cantorum that year and serendipitously met Francis Poulenc at the home of the pianist Ricardo Viñas, and later pressed into military service in an infantry unit as World War I raged. Auric's friendship with Satie hit a block just as he was about to be sent off. At Auric's going-away party, Satie got enraged at him because he discovered a hole in his trademark umbrella, and Satie was convinced that Auric had done that on purpose. Why? Who's to say? There's no motive for Auric trying to intentionally upset Satie in this way, and Satie was prone to a kind of paranoia that everyone else was after him. So this was not out of character for the eccentric Satie. Auric was mobilized in 1918, a year before he would have been scheduled to, and he absolutely hated it. Francis Poulenc was the only friend he had his age, and his body was also physically just not cut out for military service. He collapsed before he could even get to the front and was transferred to a desk job, but this meant that even though he was out of harm's way, he couldn't dive straight back into the Parisian musical scene once the armistice was declared in November of that year. His friends helped him transfer to a new post, but a severe illness in summer 1919 landed him in a hospital's mental ward. And eventually, when he was discharged for having an overly emotional constitution. Auric's place within Les Six is strikingly important because he was the dedicatee of Jean Cocteau's slim 1918 tract Le Coq et l'Éloquent. Cocteau had met Auric several years before and, like most, was impressed by the youngster. Why Auric specifically? Well, it's hard to say for certain, but there are a couple of very valid theories. Cocteau and Auric often had conversations with one another where they agreed on a lot of the ways in which French music should develop, based on Apollinaire's call for a new type of French nationalism. They would often meet at Cocteau's mother's apartment to discuss their aesthetic ideas. Auric was Cocteau's favorite musician, as Auric always positioned himself as a musician in search of painters and writers. The dedication to Auric is 2 pages long, and Cocteau cites Auric for, at a young age, having thoroughly escaped from the Germanic influences that had seeped into the rest of French music. Auric, and basically everyone in the avant-garde of Paris at the time, was at the epicenter of the new trends of surrealism and specifically Dadaism. When Dada came to Paris in January 1920, the same month that Les Six was inaugurated as such, Auric was right there in the mix. This included composing a song on a poem by the Dada poet Tristan Tzara, on Tzara's personal request. When Les Six were given their name in Henri Collet's 1920 article, Collet's hagiographic description of Auric's music puts it on par with Ravel and above that of Igor Stravinsky. For Collet, Auric's work was less primitive than the Stravinsky that Parisians, who remember the Rite of Spring's riotous 1913 premiere, knew. 1920 was a big year. It also featured Auric's first major commission, incidental music for the Molière play Les Fâcheux, followed not long thereafter by Cocteau's idea for a ballet called The Newlyweds on the Eiffel Tower. Auric had to decline the full commission due to other projects, and the production was quite bumpy. Auric and Cocteau butted heads because Auric wanted his girlfriend at the time to do all the set and costume design, and the production ended up splitting Louis Duret off from the rest of the group, just days before the premiere. And the premiere itself was marred by boos and jeers, organized by Zara because the theater earlier in the day had shut them out of a planned Dada matinee performance because they were just too rowdy. What differentiates Auric from the rest of Les Six is his interest in artistic collaboration. He felt there was much more a composer could say working with other artists than simply on their own. He believed himself to be a fundamentally theatrical composer. When he purged his juvenilia, he was left with a bunch of theatrical works and a smattering of other things. This collaborative identity didn't just extend to other individuals, but also to other groups. So this explains why Auric was the most involved with Dada of all of the Les Six composers. The Dadaists had fractured into three competing groups, and the only thing they could agree on, seemingly, was their shared distaste for Jean Cocteau. Auric was, as far as I can tell, the only Parisian artist who was capable of acting as a go-between between these different factions of Dada, as well as the Dadaists and the Cocteau followers. Les Six had been part of his fame within music, but his association with Dada helped hone his skill in writing. The internal tensions among these different Dada groups were far more hostile than their shared dislike for Cocteau, and over time, as these three factions began to split apart from one another, Auric disassociated himself from the faction of Tristan Tzara and more towards the factions of Francis Picabia and André Breton, but soon became disenchanted with Dada itself. For Auric, the movement's absurdity had worn out its welcome and deserved to be discarded into the past. The squabbles of the Dadaists contributed to Auric's writer's block as 1921 turned into 1922, and Cocteau was right to be concerned that this distraction would waste Auric's talents. Although Serge Diaghilev wanted Auric to expand his Les Fâcheux score into a ballet for his ballet Roust, Auric didn't get it done in time, and he only wrote one piece in the entirety of 1922, a piano sonatina that critics panned. It wasn't like he just had no interest in composing at all. Rather, Auric faced a crisis. He wanted to use polytonality, a signature device of Darius Milhaud's, extensively in the reworking of this ballet, but he had no idea how to do so while still retaining an innate melodic lyricism. So he wrote to Charles Coquelin, theorist, composer, and one-time mentor of the Les Six members, about this problem. It's around this time that we see Auric writing words much more. Auric's place within Les Six was augmented by his activities as a music critic. He was able to express in prose what the group was after in their music. Cleanliness, lucidity, and simplicity were things that Auric had identified as distinctly French, things that he and others wanted to preserve. Auric's critical writings give us a valuable window into what members of Les Six believed as a group. And as I mentioned in my introductory video, this is really hard to pin down. In January 1921, Auric published an article reviewing Debussy's Jeux, which on the one hand hailed Debussy for his ability to wrench French music away from the Wagnerian mold, but condemned the idea that Debussy's formula to doing so was the only way to be anti-Germanic. Hopping on the Impressionist train was just a money grab. True, authentic art could be found in Satie's Ballet Parade. After only 3.5 years, the Dada movement in Paris flamed out. In July 1923, during a multimedia performance, Dadaist rabble-rousers charged the stage multiple times, and this violence included André Breton whacking someone's arm with his cane so hard that he broke it. Breton's circle, which included Auric, no longer considered themselves Dadaist, but rather surrealist. Auric would not be in the surrealist circle for very long, but he always remained on decent terms with Breton. And why wouldn't he? After all, Auric had no interest in getting his arm broken with a cane. Auric's move away from surrealism concerns his reconnection to Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe. Auric, along with Milhaud and Poulenc, wrote for the Ballet Russe and also supplied recitatives for the spoken parts of other composers' operas. from the early to mid-1920s. Auric eventually wore out his welcome with the impresario because he sought more money than Diaghilev usually gave to young composers, but he rose in Diaghilev's mind at the expense of Milhaud, who had gone to the wrong benefit concert and was dead in Diaghilev's mind. Auric's intense financial negotiations with Diaghilev prompted Diaghilev just to never commission him again after 1925. While Satie and Auric had grown quite different from one another, they might have remained on somewhat good terms for the rest of Satie's life had Auric not lit into Satie's ballet Relâche, calling its composer a suburban pharmacist in an article. Satie shot back, calling Auric's recent productions so sugary that they were like musical lemonade, and he roped Poulenc into attacks too, since Auric and Poulenc had allied themselves to a critic named Louis Leloy, who had praised recent ballet productions by the two. Leloy had gotten Auric and Cocteau hooked on opium during a tour to Monte Carlo, and Auric was a high-functioning addict for the rest of his life, a fact which significantly curtailed his ability to travel, and it's rather a wonder he was able to be so prolific given this addiction. This wasn't Satie's beef. His problem was that Leloy had been a staunch supporter of Debussy, and he didn't think of any reason why these two composers would be hanging out with Leloy if Leloy wasn't using that opportunity to turn them against him. Auric and Poulenc thought this was just silly, and they decided to have a little fun with the easily irritated Satie. They bought a little rattle that looked like Satie and they sent it to him. And as luck would have it, this was one of the few packages that Satie actually opened. His apartment was notoriously full of unopened packages, and he got so mad at them that he never allowed them to see him for the rest of his life. Even on his deathbed, he said, "One must be intransigent, or stick in the mud," depends on how we translate it, to the last. Once Satie died in 1925, these two were especially saddened at the loss of their important aesthetic forebear. Although Les Fachos turned out to be quite a success once he'd managed to finish it off, subsequent ballet scores throughout the 1920s, while popular, didn't hit the mark critically. And so Auric was stuck in a kind of identity crisis. The question was, could he establish himself as a legitimate, mature composer and not just an overgrown prodigy? Perhaps he was more attuned and more susceptible to what critics had to say because he was part of that world himself. So to try to get out of this rut, he just worked on more collaborative projects, music for the theater as well as music for the music hall. This was probably a bad move because even though the composers of Les Six were interested in bringing these lowbrow forms into high art, actually engaging with these lowbrow forms and writing for the music hall directly was something that made the critics think that he didn't pan out, that his early success as a prodigy didn't flower into a successful, mature composer. This pressure led him to move to the suburbs for the time, and in 1927 he gave up his steady column work. In the following year he was inducted into a secret society of French gourmands known as the Club de Saint. It must be noted that Auric was a great big fan of food and not the biggest fan of exercise. Auric had found his niche in ballet and incidental music, which dovetailed nicely into the new genre of film. Auric's affinity for and skill at crafting film music was an outgrowth of all this collaborative work he'd done for the stage previously. Auric later recalled that many in his circle thought that the new medium was just preposterous or a fad, but he immediately fell in love with it. He recognized its potential. Cocteau, being a general creative type, hopped on the film bandwagon with a film called Les Anges d'un Poète, a very ambitious work that attempted to depict the creation of poetry itself. This film was underwritten by a wealthy count and dates from 1930, the same year as Auric's open marriage to the Russian expatriate Nora Vilter, a painter who would in time be quite sought after as a portrait artist. Auric composed the score for every Cocteau film for 30 years, and would often surprise Cocteau with his scores. That is, Auric didn't play Cocteau any excerpts from his score while he was still working on it. Cocteau's vision was for the music to cut against the grain of the film, to be obviously disjointed and out of place. And this is something that Auric was sort of mixed about, and no matter what happened, Cocteau would always run across a couple of points where it sounded like the music lined up. He could never quite figure out a way to put these cues into his films without something somewhere seeming like it was intentional. In 1932, Auric went in a different direction for his piano sonata after mulling a symphony. This was very much unlike the other work of Les Six, as it sidelined melody and simplicity in favor of harmonic complexity and seriousness, with a Beethovenian structure and an advanced harmonic language, somewhat like Arthur Honegger was known to write. While those closest and most sympathetic to Les Six loved the piano sonata, critics did not, and the critical reception was a factor in forcing Auric into more and more film work. Although he did follow up the piano sonata with a violin sonata from 1935 that resembled the piano sonata aesthetically. This violin sonata underwent extensive revision before publication, but it paid off. Musicologist Andre Schaffner said that Auric was a true watchmaker, and that he wrote music of spun glass.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
The trouble with all this film scoring is that Auric wasn't making enough money during the Depression to make ends meet. Nora reported that they'd reached their poorest in 1934. At one point, their only furniture were 2 beds, a piano, and a sofa, and the sofa wasn't even theirs, it was on loan from Poulenc. Desperate economic times led to political radicalization all over the world in the lead up to World War II. In France, left-wing groups, notorious, frankly, for infighting amongst themselves no matter what country you're in, bound together in a coalition called the Popular Front, much as the radicals and the socialists had done during the Viticultural Revolt in 1907. What attracted Auric and many other artists to the Popular Front was the emphasis they placed on the arts. They were against the commercialization of music, and they wanted music education to be universal. The French people's desire for change, and again, the desperate economic situation, launched the Popular Front into power in the last election before World War II. Auric played an active role in all sorts of arts programs that were an extension of this ideology, an ideology that we have to assume was not new to him considering his upbringing. It wasn't long before the left and the far left factions within the Popular Front began to disagree with one another, specifically over what they should do in the Spanish Civil War, which became something of a proxy war for the big powers that would battle it out in World War II itself. The Spanish Civil War led to Auric's only explicitly political song, a setting of a poem about the fascist bombing of the Basque town of Guernica, the same atrocity that inspired Picasso's famous painting of the same name. While it's typical to see artists as uniformly liberal, especially if you're coming from an American perspective, support of the Popular Front was not universal among Les Six. Poulenc privately expressed his trepidation about some of their more radical policies. All told, this political shift did affect Auric's musical output because even though he did continue to write film scores, he also wrote left-leaning camp songs and children's songs. However, we have to make clear that even though the Popular Front contained communist elements, it was far from the one-party communist dictatorship that you would find in, for instance, the Soviet Union, which promoted socialist realism. The French didn't do this. Instead, they promoted a kind of social realism. Their art focused on the average person. They were more interested in the activities of the common man versus, some King Louis from a couple hundred years ago. And Auric didn't really have to change his musical style for this. The films of this era used music much like incidental music in a play. There wasn't a constant interplay between what was said, what was shown, and the music that was laying underneath it. Instead, the music would just come at random spots that the music felt appropriate to be in. Again, really much more like a play. So Auric's support of the Popular Front has something to do with just how much they were going to support the arts. He knew that he wouldn't have to change what he did, he just wanted more films to score. During these years, the government served as an avenue for getting music out to new audiences. And Auric was, even in the very flexible group of composers known as Les Six, one of its most flexible members. He had no pretensions on what kind of commissions he would accept or fulfill. Actually, he felt like it was kind of a challenge to see how much different stuff he could do. Cocteau, who, let's be honest, wasn't entirely unbiased here, said that Auric's music was so natural that it sounded like it sprang right out of the set design. Yet we see, especially through the 1930s, tinges of an unhappy composer. The music that propelled he and his friends to fame wasn't where he was anymore. Pieces like the piano sonata and the violin sonata were just not what people seem to want to hear. Pieces like the 1938 Wind Trio seem intentionally retrospective, almost nostalgic, like Auric is looking back on the heyday of Les Six, and this turned out to be one of his most popular pieces. One of the few Auric pieces that you're still going to find programmed on concerts. Meanwhile, his film scores and the increase in quality of European films in general caught international attention. American composer George Antheil highlighted Auric's ability to put music in unorthodox spots. During World War II, Auric was one of the 4 members of Les Six to stick it out in France and help the resistance. After German forces crashed in May 1940, the Aurics fled to Vichy, France, the technically unoccupied but still collaborationist part of the French Empire. Auric would return to Paris frequently for work, and the Nazi propagandists, led by Joseph Goebbels, assured that no music by Jews would be performed even though the Parisian theater scene was to open and perform as usual. Auric was then put in the weird spot of being commissioned to write incidental music for a play that, had this ban not been in effect, he wouldn't have had to write. He was subbing music in for that which had previously been written for the play by his friend Darius Milhaud. Auric's motivations, like many in the first few years of the war, were monetary. It was understood that if you had to do business with the Germans just to make ends meet, to put food on the table, then that was understandable. But in 1943, he joined the Front National de la Musique, which was the musical arm of the French resistance, and he set pro-resistance poems, and this changed his musical language a little bit because he was fond of sticking in little bits of the French national anthem anywhere he could. Once the fighting was over, Auric found himself in a good financial spot. Unlike a lot of other composers, he had established his niche in film music early, and as other composers turned to film music to pay the bills, well, he was the go-to guy. He effectively had the right of first refusal on a lot of films, and he tried to fulfill all of these, but he ended up overworking himself on at least one occasion and had to call in Germain Théâtre in order to help him get a commission in on time. Auric also applied the film music production process to new ballet scores. He would, in an unorthodox way, allow the legendary choreographer Léonide Messine to create movement first, on which the music would then be inspired. Auric's film work is perhaps most familiar to English-speaking cinephiles for 1952's Moulin Rouge and 1953's Roman Holiday. Auric pursued a utilitarian approach to film music and was proud of his work within the field, even as those within the classical world shunned and thought less of scoring films. A waltz that he penned for Moulin Rouge punched well above its weight as it was turned into the top 10 single, Where Is Your Heart? This shocked Auric, and his friends reported hearing this tune everywhere they went. Train stations, just out and about in the city, people would be humming it. It was truly an international phenomenon. It landed him in hot water as an amateur songwriter from Washington, D.C. named Sidney Hershon sued both Auric and United Artists for ripping him off. In the trial, Auric played a bunch of music on a wheeled-in piano to prove that the notes themselves, the trial hinged on the actual notes that were used in the opening, and he proved that the notes themselves in different orders had been used by composers throughout the centuries. And he just kept on playing different examples of this until he had made his point. Examples which went all the way back to Beethoven and even before. The same arpeggiation had been used throughout the scope of music history, but the jury was hung, so nobody got the sweet satisfaction of victory in that case. This wasn't the first time that Auric had run afoul of the perennially labyrinthine world of copyright law. Back in 1932, the royalties for his score of the film À nous la liberté weren't up to what he expected, upon which he realized that he had signed away more of his royalties than anticipated. Later, in the age of decolonization, Auric was a staunchly pro-European voice in the debate as to how to tinker with international copyright law to best accommodate the developing world, all these new nations which now populated the globe. The argument from the developing world was that, hey, we need some kind of loophole or exception to the international copyright laws in order for us to, develop. Whereas Auric realized that, well, that actually might be causing more problems than solutions. It wasn't like he was unsympathetic to the plight of these new nations. And in fact, he worked closely with a lot of the former French colonies to set up their own organizations so that they could protect the copyrights of their artists. Despite the occasional copyright hassle, the financial kickback to Auric was enormous. He was a millionaire. He didn't have to keep working, but he kept composing just for the love of it. This was his bread and butter despite his new involvement in various administrative roles. He took on his first administrative post in 1954 as the head of France's Composers Union, a post he would hold off and on for the next 23 years. In 1962, Auric was given complete control over all of French opera, the Paris Opera and the Opéra Comique, and he was tasked with bringing French opera back. These two institutions were deep in the red. Their productions were not what they once were, and he wanted full artistic control of both of them. He focused on the Paris Opera. He wrenched it out of its old musical conservatism by playing operas of Lesseps and also modernist masterpieces like Alban Berg's Wozzeck. He cleaned up sloppiness by saying that everyone had to be there for every rehearsal, something that the union screamed about because they thought it was a traitorous action for someone who headed a union. The performance of Berg's Wozzeck, conducted by Pierre Boulez, took 7.5 times the standard rehearsal time, but it was all worth it. It was financially successful. Auric had, despite fierce resistance, brought the Paris Opera back. Under his tenure, the Paris Opera turned a profit for the first time in 50 years. The Opéra Comique, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. They folded in 1972, and their staff merged with the Paris Opera. He had time to compose in here somehow, and his work ethic is just incredible. Consider that whenever composers take administrative roles, their output tends to decrease. But between 1958 and 1962, he wrote 18 film scores. His operatic administration was a mere 6 years, as he wanted to spend more time writing concert pieces. And once he did, he wrote a series of them known as the Imagines, between 1969 and 1976. These constitute some of his final works, the third of which is a serial work. Ironic that both Auric and Germain Taillefer's sole forays into serialism come in late works for clarinet. Auric and his wife Nora were getting into bad shape. Nora's mind was the first to go, and after she died after a horrific fall down a flight of stairs, it wasn't that long before Auric married his second wife, Michelle Battiani, who was a whole half-century younger than him. They didn't end up having that much of a life together because they enjoyed eating dinner together and going to the movies together, but he wasn't long for this earth either. His mind started to go in early 1983, and he died in July of that year at the age of 84. Auric's music is known today through a very narrow slice of the concert repertoire and a little more among film lovers. You can make the argument that the guy basically picked the wrong genre of concert music to go into. He loved art song, but there's already plenty of those to choose from, and he liked writing ballet music, but ballet is basically the Nutcracker in 9.5 months of the company's losing money. He simply loved writing incidental music, and when he was asked about absolute music, that is music that exists for its own sake, not a collaborative work and not inspired by anything or following some kind of program, he said that it was actually a slippery slope towards this false notion that the symphony reigned supreme, something that, as a member of Lesseps, he was kind of obliged to be at least somewhat against. And even though he did mull a symphony at some point, he never went through with it. Writing in collaborative contexts allowed him to express himself the way he wanted to the most. And he loved composing for these things. He would spend up to 15 hours a day composing if he could, and in his bathrobe if the circumstances allowed. He thought of himself less as a composer and more as a musician who worked every day. And if we take all of his activities together, he really was a Renaissance man of music in the French 20th century.